Faza'il A'mal, more trouble than it's worth. Part 9. Weak hadith in belief.
Daif hadith. So just because the hadith is daif, no one is telling you to pray or to base your aqidah upon daif hadith. It is just for encouragement. And the
Here we have the cult follower telling us that weak ahadith cannot be accepted in belief or legislation. However, this principle that he's set forth is something that his predecessor and the person he's trying to defend, Sheikh Zakaria, this is something that he does in his book. He does mention weak hadith, very, very weak hadiths in relation to beliefs. So they're not consistent in their own principles and their rules. And like I've said before, on many occasions, they repeat again and again and again the same errors without any regard for revision or correction. And the problem is, this book is widespread throughout hundreds of mosques throughout the world in Arabic, English and Urdu, and there is no one to take them to task. So what I want to do in this part is discuss with you the conditions for when weak hadith can be taken. Then I'll give you a summary of those conditions, and then I'll give you examples of how it's very problematic that the author of the Fada'il A'mal, the FA, Sheikh Zakaria, he falls into the mistakes that scholars warned of not falling into when quoting weak hadith. So the first thing is, here is the chapter breakdown of weak hadith. It's a whole chapter 2, discussing what the weak hadiths are, and it's very, very detailed, so you should read it for yourself. It's about 60 pages discussing the topic, and he gives the explanation first in a detailed form, which I'll give you, and then he gives it in a summarized form. So I'll go through it quite meticulously, so there's no doubt left as to what exactly can be used in terms of weak hadith. So the first condition he gives is the hadith should not be very weak, in the sense that it shouldn't be a solitary report, and the one narrating it should not be a liar. That's the first condition. The second condition is the fact that the hadith should fall under a common principle. So it should be something that is common, and it does not contradict anything that's established within the religion. That's the explanation that he gives. The third condition for a weak hadith is that when you're acting upon such a hadith, you shouldn't believe that it's authentic. So you shouldn't actually think this is something that's an authentic statement of the Prophet, action or tacit approval. So you should know that it's weak. And the fourth condition is it shouldn't be propagated, so that a hadith that is da'if is not acted upon thinking that it's authentic, and it's not something that is deemed by the Shari'iyah, and it shouldn't be propagated. So that fourth condition, the TJ clearly break that condition, because they propagate these weak fabricated mawdu' hadiths without any consideration for telling people whether it's fabricated or not. So then he gives later on in the conclusion 6 conditions for weak hadith. The first is that it should not be weak or very weak. The second, that in general it should not invalidate another act or a belief. Third, the person should not be convinced of its authenticity. The fourth, it should not be spread. So exactly the same as the 4 conditions I've given, but he gives 2 more conditions. 5, it does not contradict an authentic hadith or stronger evidence. And 6, that it does not contain additional details, estimations or specifications over those mentioned in authentic hadith. So it's fleshed out a bit more in the second, the last screenshot I gave. It explains it in a bit more detail. But now we come to the issue of hadiths not being acceptable for ahkam, which is what exactly the speaker at the beginning said. We don't accept them for ahkam, and we don't accept them in our, as he says, aqidah, our belief. And so here a hadith is given, and the hadith actually states, this is the wording of the hadith: Allah, God, recited the chapter of Yasin and the chapter of Taha 1,000 years before creating the heavens and the earth. When the angels heard the recitation, they said, "Blessed will be the people on whom this will be revealed. Blessed will be their hearts that will contain this, and blessed will be the tongues that recite this." This is a very weak hadith, and he explains exactly why it's a weak hadith. And one of the narrators of this hadith, because this is something that the TJ commonly say, they say that people say that our book should be burned. I've never heard anyone say that the book of the FA should be burned. I have said it should be pulped, it should not be distributed. But if you read the top line here, Ahmed said, "We burned his hadith," meaning we burned the hadith of the person that narrated this. Yahya said he has no value. Ali said he is not trustworthy. Nasa'i said his hadith is rejected. Daraqutni said weak. Ibn Hibban said he used to buy books and report from them without actually hearing. So the issue of burning hadith is something that's present within the literature, and you can judge that how you want. But the point is, this hadith states that God recited something. So he mentions at the bottom, if we look carefully at the text of the hadith, it implies Allah's recitation. Allah's recitation implies that He speaks one of His attributes. Matters of creed and legal rulings do not admit weak ahadith. Here is Sheikh Zakaria using the weak hadith and going into the area of aqidah. Again, another reason why the TJ's main book, the FA, should be pulped. Enough with the TJ, enough with the FA. Now we come to this master's thesis submitted to the University of Birmingham in 1982, and it's written by a scholar called Suhaib Hassan Abdul Ghaffar. It's called Criticism of Hadith Among Muslims with Reference to Sunan Ibn Majah. And he states, the reason why I bring this book is it's a very good read. It goes through the history, it gives reasons for why people propagated weak hadith, and it goes into very intense detail of exactly how isnads are critiqued, and he himself critiques 10 isnads himself. But if you look at the top page of this hadith, and this is hadith number 4, it gives you the isnad, which is the chain of narration, and it gives you the text underneath. But there's one thing that you should be able to work out if you've been paying attention in these series, where it says Ibn Majah and it has in brackets HA. That stands for Haddathana, means it was narrated. Then thereafter it says An Suraqa bin Muhammad bin Suqa, An Ibrahim, An al-Aswad, An Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, the Prophet. So those terms, Haddathana and An, are the terms that I mentioned previously that hadith narrators would use in order to show exactly how they received each particular report, and in which order they received it, and the way that they received it. And another page here, again we have the isnad, and we also have the text. This is another weak hadith, it's spurious, but there's another term, there's Haddathana and there's Na. So it says Abdul Razak Na ibn Jurayj, second isnad to ibn Jurayj, Abu Ubaidah ibn Abi Nasr, Haddathana Hajjaj ibn Muhammad, Haddathana ibn Jurayj, Na Ibrahim ibn Muhammad ibn Abi Atha, An Musa ibn Wardan, An Abi Huraira, the Prophet. So here we've got the extra term Na, Na, and I gave this in a previous edition where Na is a shortened form of Haddathana. Or it could be that this NA could stand for another technical way of receiving the hadith between Ibn Jurayj and Ibrahim ibn Muhammad ibn Abi Atha in this particular isnad. So this is a very detailed, unique science, and certain sects, certain groups have no respect for this science. Stay tuned for many more parts.